All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our monthly webinar. As folks are logging in, I just want to encourage you all to put your name in the chat if you'd like to introduce yourself to everyone and select all panelists and attendees on the drop-down menu so that all folks will see that if you would like. And we'll be using the chat box today for questions. So again, if you want everybody to see your question, feel free to select all panelists and attendees. My name's Brandy Waliga, and I'm here with Violence Free Colorado. I do some technical assistance and training, and I'd like to introduce Graham Hackett, who is the Social Change Program Manager at Advocates of Routt County up in Steamboat. And before we get started, I do want to let you all know a couple things. So we are recording this webinar, and also want to let you know a couple features. So here at Violence Free Colorado, we do have what's called rev.com. So if you look on your screen on the bottom, it says live transcript with a CC. So feel free, if you would like the live transcript and you want to see the captions during the webinar, feel free to click on that and you can turn them on. And you can also turn them off if you don't like them. So as I also mentioned earlier, feel free to use the chat. If you have questions or technical issues or anything, just let us know. And we'll be looking at the chat for questions throughout the whole webinar. So anytime you have questions, feel free to do that. One other piece of information I want to let you all know is that we are actually changing the name of our webinar, which used to be called the Brown Bag Webinar, and we're actually changing it to Facts and Snacks. So please be on the lookout. We're going to have an announcement going out later this week to explain that change and the reason why that change is important, to move away from using racial stereotyping language. And we're also excited to embrace facts and snacks. So be on the lookout for that. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Graham, and feel free, again, as folks are logging in, if you want to introduce yourself, name, pronoun, organization, feel free to do that in the chat too. So thank you, Graham.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Hey, everyone. My name is Graham Hackett. He, him are my pronouns. I'm the Social Change Program Manager for Advocates of Routt County. I'm actually really thrilled to be here with you all to share a little bit about how we have approached building our social change program. And I'm new to Colorado, so I'm really excited to ultimately meet all of you who are doing such good work across the state. Just to introduce myself briefly, I have been on a very interesting path throughout my entire life. Professionally, I built and led programs for high-risk youth for the first part of my career. I worked with juvenile inmates for several years, where I learned a lot about the impacts of trauma and the roots of toxic masculinity. I pivoted into doing this type of work in 2014 when I built a touring program to colleges to promote consent and bystander intervention. Subsequently, I was the rape prevention education coordinator for the Crisis Center of Buncombe County in North Carolina, where I excelled to become the director of prevention programs there. And then my mom ended up having 3 surgeries in a year, so I decided to come out to Colorado, where I am fortunate to have been able to join forces with Advocates of Routt County. Personally, I have had a very wild story. I've lived in 9 different states. I've lived in urban and rural areas, on farms, and in major cities. I grew up in a household with periodic episodes of domestic violence that led me to become primary care provider for my 10-year-old little sister when I was in my 20s. So as far as qualifications go, there's nothing quite like suddenly becoming a parent for a tween girl that is like a crash course in threat assessment. So I bring a wide range of experiences to the table, and yeah, I've been looking at this social change stuff for a really long time, and I'm excited to kind of give you the backdrop of how we have shaped our program at Advocates of Routt County. So please, throughout the course of this, feel free to chime into the chat with any questions that you have. I love questions. I adore them. I'm going to try and get a lot of information out in front of you in a very short period of time. So if there's something that needs clarity or anything that you really need to comment on in the moment, I hope that you'll feel free. The idea overall is that social change is prevention work. Many crisis centers have prevention departments, and they focus on primary prevention, secondary, and tertiary. We look at a much wider lens of issues in order to effectively reach the people that are the most vulnerable to sexual and domestic violence in our communities. I'm not going to be going over anything that is extremely graphic or triggering, but even these topics have some impact on people. So I just wanted to encourage everyone to please feel free to take care of yourself. And if you need, feel free to use our Safe Line if you just need somebody to talk to. We've got an amazing group of advocates, so you can speak to a live person if you just need a moment to unpack some things. So social change, it's complicated, right? It's really, really challenging. There are a lot of people who recognize that we have issues throughout our society that need to be addressed. And there is a general kind of apathy towards jumping in among the masses to not only engage and try and rectify a lot of these social issues, but even to think about it or talk about it, because these topics are so heavy, they're burdensome. So what we try to do is frame things in a way that is creative and ultimately inspiring. We recognize that outrage is a very powerful motivator for people, but we also want to acknowledge that inspiration is a profound motivator as well. So how do we get people to change? How do we get people to want to engage with this type of conversation? We got to start somewhere. And the fact of the matter is that our society is super weird about sexuality, right? We are bombarded from all sides by sexual imagery and storylines through TV, ads, movies, video games. All of online life is hypersexualized, but we're also being taught this shame and stigma that makes it so that we're not really supposed to talk about it or pay attention to it. And it's a very strange thing. It's very confusing for a lot of people. And I put this example, consider the magic of a camera, just for one thing that's super weird about sexuality in America. If someone is paid to perform a sex act, widely that is considered prostitution, and it is considered illegal in this country in most places. But you add a camera to it, suddenly it's pornography, absolutely legal, absolutely able to be sold as a product. So what is it about the camera that changes the exact same act from illegal to absolutely legal and ubiquitous? Our culture is strange like that. We have a lot of contradictory messages and a lot of contradictory ideas out there. So we have to start unpacking these things to try to understand where we're at a little bit better. All of us know this already, but these issues are incredibly complex. Human sexuality and relationships and violence prevention are not one thing. They can't be siloed that easily because so many other issues are related to it that we have to have a relationship to all these topics in order to get a big picture look at how ultimately we want to approach changing conditions to improve safety for everybody. So what is social change? Well, by definition, it is an alteration of the mechanisms within a society characterized by changes in the rules, which is a really interesting phenomenon. When it comes to behavior, social organization, or value systems, how do we start to shift the way people relate to their communities? How do we shift attitudes, which can modify behavior? How do we update social organizations and how our hierarchy plays into people being subjected to unfair treatment? And ultimately, when it comes down to morality and ethics, how do we start to improve the way that people relate to cultivating a value system that works for everybody in their community and not just themselves? There are many factors that can drive social change. Ones that are out of our control often make the biggest changes. So conquerors' catastrophes have a huge impact. Western society is almost defined by violent domination. And so that entire concept, that ethos, is almost baked into our society in a lot of ways. So a lot of people assume that violence is endemic to our population. but we know better. We know that it's preventable, right? How do we change the groupthink around social change to recognize that violence doesn't have to be part of our society at all? And I know this is pie in the sky, high level thinking, but keeping that point of reference is incredibly valuable for keeping all of our efforts on track. Obviously, we've got no control over catastrophes. We have seen huge impacts from COVID on not only school and work life, but our rates of domestic violence locally we've gotten a 71% spike in crisis calls related to domestic violence. So these catastrophes are changing the dynamics, even of the issues that we're trying to address in real time every day. And we have to adapt. We have to try to figure out how to modify our approach. So collective action is the one that we do have control over. It's the one where if we can mobilize enough people to engage and start to shift attitudes, again, we can shift behaviors. And this is really the heart and soul of what we're trying to do with social change in our prevention program, essentially. One other thing that probably belongs on this list is innovation. Technology has had a huge impact on the way that we communicate, the way that we conduct commerce, the way that we court each other, and the way that we relate to each other. So we have to keep in mind that there are big forces moving across our society all the time, and we need to recalibrate and calculate for all of these things as we try to do this work successfully. One big thing about the issues of sexual and domestic violence is that it seems like it's very common thinking that there is a perpetrator and a victim. And the way most people seem to think about these issues is in those terms, right? An individual and an individual, and they're not commonly regarded as social issues or problems that have resulted from social conditions. So reframing away from the social narratives that promote rugged individualism and you do you, I'll do me, I don't have to deal with you because, that's not the way we do it in America, right? We're not socialized to think in terms of community health as much as we are about, personal well-being, right? But it's a public safety issue that everyone has a role to play in. And framing our conversations in these terms can start to help people to shift their way of thinking away from that individual versus individual, that's the only problem there is, to a broader scope that as a community, as every community has work to do to try and shift the conditions that cause violence. I see like the flashing chat thing, but I can't see any chats. Are there anything that should be addressed right now?
We don't have any questions right now, Grant. We just have folks introducing themselves and
oh, great. I can't wait to read.
Confirming we're recording.
Fantastic. Okay, I appreciate it. So where do we start? All right. Obviously, our culture is incredibly dynamic and it's shifting pretty rapidly these days. But we want to at least try to, if we want to affect change, we have to know where to start, right? So establishing a baseline, a lot of us are already aware of the statistics that are put out by national leaders in violence prevention. This graphic refers to a common ratio that's put out there that 1 in 5 women are going to experience sexual violence in their lifetimes, which sounds like a lot, but it's also a little abstract. So we did a little bit of math and we determined that with 166 million women in the United States, 1 in 5 refers to over 33 million will experience sexual violence in their lifetimes, most of them before the age of 24. Which means a huge cross-section of our population is living traumatized, right? We know that there are comparable rates of violence against men, in particular when they're young, but because of shame and stigma, we don't have accurate statistics. There are widely varying reports out there. And we know that about 50% of the LGBTQ population experiences sexual violence in their lifetimes. These numbers are epidemic. This is a violent crisis that is not really being prioritized by our entire society, much less being addressed in effective ways to try and mitigate the rates of violence. The last thing I'll say is that we all know that reporting rates are artificially low. So even that, multi-million number that I quoted a moment ago is artificially low. Some reports say 50 to 60%, and some say higher go unreported. So what are we talking about here? We're really talking about one of the most pervasive, long-standing, and brutal violent epidemics in the history of our society that doesn't get a minute of airtime. Sexual violence does not get the front page very often because it's tough for people to think about. It's burdensome, right? But we have to keep the scope of this in mind and relay that to people so they can understand the gravity of things that much better. It's similar with domestic abuse. We all are, I'm sure, familiar with a lot of these statistics, and they vary, depending on the source. But the fact is, it's, again, happening at alarming rates, this intimate partner violence, from dating violence all the way into domestic violence with married couples and beyond. The rates of this violence are having, broad impacts, in particular on children, among the communities of the people that are involved. So the reach of these impacts is expansive. And we have to, again, just look at the scope really carefully. We have to, in order to be successful for social change, and in particular, in order to make sure that we are serving the most vulnerable populations that will be subjected to sexual and domestic violence, we have to really pay attention to, how these marginalized populations are being treated, where they stand in our society, what progress has been made, in order to make sure that our programs are effectively reaching them and are effective in the way that they reach them as well. So we know that the LGBTQ population is struggling. We also know that race is a huge issue in our culture. And I know that this is very sensitive for people. It's been politicized in a lot of ways, but nothing I'm saying is political. This is a purely academic exercise. So simply put, I'm curious, I want to give about 30 seconds to let you drop something in the chat, if you will. What do you think I mean using the term racism is the shark? It's not the shark, it's the water. What does that refer to? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Just jot something really quickly into the chat. Racism isn't the shark, it's the water. I want to field a response or two before I just keep going. Any thoughts?
We have one participant who's curious about the answer, who wants to know.
Sure. Any projections, anyone?
I think it's a couple things. So one person says that guns aren't the problem, it's the criminals. Another person says it is a system we all exist in, but not a problem of individuals. And it looks like, I think I saw someone raising their hand and they just unraised it. So if you just raised your hand, feel free to type in the chat if you're able to. If not, I'll keep an eye out for your hand again, but I didn't see who it was. We also have, it's the culture that surrounds us, like air. It's not the act of racism, it's the culture we're living in that accepts it. Our society is inherently racist as a whole.
Those are great.
Yeah.
Thank you all. That's fantastic feedback, and I'm glad there's a pretty wide range of different perspectives on this. It's pretty indisputable at this point that America has been founded on white supremacist principles, right? So, I mean, from the original genocide of the Native people to the enslavement of Black people that lasted 400 years of this country's lifetime, and we're only a couple of generations ahead of that. So, unfortunately, a lot of the biases that have shaped the worldview of previous generations still linger today in ways that we're not even conscious of. Most people are not virulently racist. That would be the shark. So when people think of racism, they think of the KKK. They think of all the hate crimes and things like that. When actually our society is set up to the advantage of white people through most systems, right? We're also beset with a lot of implicit bias that people are not conscious of, so their behaviors are causing harm when they're not even aware of it or doing it intentionally. So really, we just have to be conscious of this in order to embrace the circumstances that people of color are facing in our society on a regular basis, so that we can adapt our programs and be responsive to these circumstances that they're facing. Many of you may have heard this term intersectionality. I just want to take a brief moment to outline it for you. So the idea is that many people have vulnerable identities. So for example, as I've been saying, LGBTQ plus people are vulnerable, are at higher risk of being victimized, right? If they are also a person of color, that exponentially compounds their risk of being subjected to violence. If they are a queer person of color who is also disabled, they're at extremely elevated risk and vulnerability for potentially being victimized. So all of us have multiple identities depending on our age, where we're living, our identity, you know, our various social identities and abilities, right? But we have to be paying extra close attention to the compounded risk of people who have intersectional vulnerable identities. An easier way to look at it is through this cartoon. Most of us, many of us, I won't say most of us, but many of us work in silos. So we have child abuse over here, we have domestic violence over here, we have suicide prevention over here, substance abuse over here, and we don't often recognize how these issues intersect to create the social problems that we're trying to address. This example with homelessness, we would love to just, you know, solve the lack of shelter for people, and that's that. We solved the issue. But that's not really what's causing the homelessness issue exclusively. There's plenty of housing out there, but there's so many other factors that go into why someone is suffering from this social issue that we have to calculate for, and again, try to integrate into our work so that we can be more effective for people that are more vulnerable in a dynamic array of different ways. So I'm not going to, you know, read you all these definitions. We're all familiar with these terms. Many of us may not have really thought through the specifics of how they function in our communities, though, how they are executed among our social groups, right? I just wanted to underscore a couple of these things. I brought up implicit bias a little bit earlier. Again, this is subconscious stuff. As young people, we are programmed a certain way. In my hometown, I remember pretty vividly that they modified Martin Luther King's holiday to be Lee Jackson King Day. This was in Virginia. So they were celebrating Confederate Civil War icons at the same time as Martin Luther King, which is a very subtle way of undercutting, you know, King's relevance and message by diluting it, particularly with, you know, Confederate soldiers. But these types of, you know, exercises in messaging are setting us up to think about things in a certain way. They modify our subconscious thinking so that we are subjected to biases that maybe we're not even aware of. The other thing that I point out constantly when we're looking at the issue of perpetrators is this entitlement. Obviously, you know, men have a certain degree of power and privilege in our society. You know, we live in a patriarchy. There's no second guessing that or whatsoever. But when that power and privilege is leveraged as entitlement, like someone deserves to be able to act however they want or treat someone else however they want because they're more important. That is really toxic. This entitlement is the root of so much toxic behavior. So how do we identify it? And then how do we mitigate it? Well, we have very powerful forces across our society that are shaping the way that we think about things all the time. Obviously, as young people, we are sponges for the information that our family gives us, attitudes, outlooks, perspectives, all these things. We inherit those things as young people, right? So we have to take them into consideration. Ultimately, we make our own decisions about what we take and what we leave from the teachings of our family. But we definitely get a huge amount of input from family and people that are close to us when we're young. Education system has a lot of impact, and just education itself as a practice can have immense impact. Politics, we know. Media, want to talk about a little bit more here in a moment. So looking at family again, really briefly, many of us have heard of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. If you haven't heard of this yet, please have a look at it. It is a study that has some profound implications regarding how our character makeup is impacted by a variety of different factors that we may experience as young people. So if there's constant arguing, housing insecurity, food insecurity, violence, all these things, reach young people at an intrinsically formative level, right? So people with a high ACE score who have multiple factors that impact their well-being as young people can and do ultimately become dysfunctional adults, right? So ACE scores play a huge role in the root causes for violence. The socialization of men. But trust me, growing up as one, I went through a lot of the episodes of just gender policing. What does it mean to be a real man, right? And when it's defined by a lot of qualities that are not necessarily healthy in a social context, so aggression and dominance, not showing emotions, except one, anger is always available to men. So our entire emotional worlds are being kind of funneled through anger. Even the American Psychological Association, I think the report was last year, pointed out that traditional masculinity is harmful, right? So we have to look at how men are being socialized to potentially be aggressive, dominant, and potentially harmful just by being a man, a stereotypical man in our modern society. Media plays an immense role, an outsized role in this generation more than ever before in the history of the planet, right? So the average teenager is spending 7 hours a day in front of a screen outside of schoolwork, right? That's basically getting up, getting on the phone, going to school, being on a screen all day, probably while you're on your phone, coming home, gaming for hours at a time, watching a series of TV or movies in a row while you're on your phone probably. And that is so much input. We really are, I don't think we've adapted effectively to understanding how much influence that degree of media consumption is having on young people, right? So when we have, ad execs that want to be edgy and controversial, young minds can't wrap their heads around what edgy is about. They're going to assume that, a Dolce & Gabbana ad like this on a billboard is perfectly acceptable behavior with multiple half-undressed men pinning a woman down, when obviously that is severely problematic. Games have learned, gaming producers have learned that controversy sells units. Grand Theft Auto, about 8 or 9 years ago, came out with a program where you could have sex with a prostitute and then beat her up and get your money back. Why is that in the coding in the first place is a pretty good question. Here's the thing, when the controversy came out and there was all this pushback, the profile of the game went through the roof and they ended up selling billions of dollars worth of units. So video games, they're unabashed in their sexism and extreme violence. Even traditional media, we love Disney. We have a fondness for Disney, but you don't kiss people while they're asleep, So even some of the fundamental principles about consent are missing in a lot of traditional media that, we may not have thought about before, but it's had influence on a lot of people's thinking about what's okay and what's not, or how to behave along gender lines in particular. And I can spend an entire presentation talking about the impact of pornography, but we'll leave that for just a moment. The internet is a wild place. We use this image to explain to young people about catfishing and how there are, people that are misidentifying themselves online. But there are so many head fakes and misdirects and misinformation sources online that it's dizzying. Honestly, I went down the rabbit hole of dating apps not long ago, And it is it is the wilderness out there. There is so much scamming and hustling and questionable content and links to potential malware and the internet is wild. That's all I can say. And it's having impacts on people, on how we communicate, on how much trust we have, on all of us, all the time. We have to factor these things in. And I know this is a lot, but it's worth at least trying to wrap our heads around the biggest possible picture. So most of the country doesn't really provide adequate sex education. I think it's 35 states provide some version of it. A good proportion of those are abstinence only instead of comprehensive sex ed. So young people are naturally curious. We can't fault them for that. I think that all of us were young once and we're probably curious about, intimacy and how it works. So without having access to adequate education that really is candid, medically accurate, and inclusive, we are leaving young people to fend for themselves and figure all this stuff out on their own. Hopefully they've got an amazing parent that's able to have a very candid talk with them. And largely our entire society says that's who's responsible for having the talk, right, with their kids and making sure they're set up for success in relationships. But honestly, the talk is awkward. Parents don't often know the nuances of consent necessarily, or the modern dating arena, to really empower their kids with how to treat people the way that they need to be treated in order to set boundaries to make sure that they're treated the way they want to be treated. So young people are turning to pornography in big numbers. The average age for a boy to be exposed for pornography the first time is 11 years old. An entire generation of 11-year-old boys getting access to the internet, again, a wild place, where they have multiple lifetimes worth of free, high-quality streaming pornography that they can look at. And there are rabbit holes that you can go down that get increasingly more intense until you may see some things you can't unsee, right? There is brutal content out there, and it's affecting relationships. It's affecting the way people approach intimacy. It's affecting the perception of gender roles and how we're supposed to relate to each other. So we need to at least try to offer this generation critical thinking skills to evaluate all of the media that they are, consuming, but in particular, explicit media. There has to be a way to talk about this. We have to get past the shame and the stigma, because young people are being impacted by it in visceral ways, and it's no doubt causing harm. All right, so that's the baseline. That's kind of where we're at. So, politics, media, social norms, multiple vulnerable identities that are being impacted by various oppressive forces, right? It's big. It's a lot to wrap our heads around, but we can start to modify our programs and our projects in a way that addresses each of these issues carefully, right? So one of the obvious ways that we can influence our state and our local playing field, as it were, is lobbying. Many of us have funding through federal grants that have restrictions around us doing lobbying for legislation. However, we can still discuss other political issues if it's unrelated to specific legislation. So I think it's Reliance actually did a training about how to effectively lobby, how to set up the meeting, how to have your talking points ready, who to bring with you, and really starting to do that degree of civic engagement can have wide-reaching impacts. So locally, we've had some significant issues with COVID, obviously, and the way that domestic violent abusers are being let out on bond over and over and over again, even if they violate the bond, because they don't want to keep people in jail for risk of getting infected. Well, there was no compensating for letting these abusers out. There was no local system set up for monitoring them if they are out on bond. So we've had numerous episodes of abusers going back to harass their victims because, even though they're breaking bond, what are they going to do? they're not going to jail. They go back in front of a judge and they're getting bonded out again. So locally, we started doing some civic action to get pretrial services set up in this region. And we've engaged with the chief judge and law enforcement and multiple folks. So this civic action is going to have tangible results on the safety of survivors. There are lots of ways to engage with the government that isn't necessarily lobbying, is my point. And it's worth figuring out how to engage effectively to improve the safety for the people that we're trying to serve. Social change is really dynamic. On the left, we've got what every single person in our society needs in order to be fully successful, to be fully realized and reach their fullest potential. If any one of the things on the left in that list is not available or is inadequate, it can completely stall out someone's ability to succeed as a citizen in our culture. If if they don't have security or mental health care or housing, any one of those things can leave someone extremely vulnerable to violence in particular. And then the wheel here on the right about collective action, there are so many different ways to engage in order to improve social conditions. And obviously, we are focused on kind of that bottom to the right wedge of advocacy. So we're playing our part in the collective action that can ultimately lead to social change. But we need to engage the rest of our community that are doing similar types of work in order to improve conditions for the citizens in our communities. When we engage with them, we can understand better how we all fit together, how we might collaborate, and ultimately how we can have a bigger impact. Media is not all bad. I know I kind of gave it a bad rap earlier for its negative influences, but the fact is that, media is it's double-edged. On the one hand, it's a massive threat to public safety. On the other hand, these tools are incredible. The Me Too movement had 12 million impressions, so likes or retweets or whatever, had 3 million engagements. 12 million engagements in the first 24 hours. 12 million in the first 24 hours. Like, that degree of visibility for an issue like ours is very rare. And ever since then, this has been at least a point of reference for our modern culture to try to wrap their heads around the issue of sexual misconduct or harassment in the workplace. And so leveraging these tools to the best of our ability can have far-reaching impacts, and we might be able to reach people that we don't typically have access to. So really embracing technology while recognizing that it's got some trappings as well, it can be an incredible tool for us. So we look at culture, we look at collective action, and then we boil it down to individuals. Every single person has a role to play. Every single person has influence over their social groups, right? Or their families. So a lot of people I don't think have really accounted for how much power they have to affect change. Setting a different boundary that problematic behavior is unacceptable to you. Just by doing that among your teams, clubs, coworkers, intimate partners, whatever, is setting a standard and modeling this behavior so that other people will understand boundaries better, or what is unacceptable behavior better because somebody spoke up. Every person, if every person does this to some degree, ultimately we reach a tipping point within a given community. And this is, many of you have heard of Green Dot. This is borrowed from Green Dot, that within a given population, if you can outflank problem behaviors with pro-social behaviors that will keep people safer and outnumber them drastically, there's a tipping point where the attitudes among a population will have changed to the point where their behavior starts to change. And especially when it comes to people that want to push their luck, if enough people set these boundaries and express an intolerance for problematic behavior that can lead to assault, then ultimately someone who thinks they can get away with it isn't going to feel that way because no one around them is supportive or staying silent, right? So how do we reach this tipping point? This is what we're doing at Advocates of Routt County. we have decided through the lens of everything that I've just discussed about how to modify our outlook on the work of preventing sexual and domestic violence. We have taken the wide angle lens, looking at all these factors of intersectionality and media influence, et cetera, and try to apply them all to our projects and programs. So borrowing heavily from the CDC's socio-ecological model, we decided that we need to target specifically our efforts to these different labels of groupings of society, right? So we have to do one-on-one individual work, and even for prevention, right? So obviously we develop programs and offer coaching. We really try to get one-on-one with people in class if possible, and offer deeper Q&As every chance that we can, so that they can deepen their knowledge and take it further. And again, trying to empower the individual to recognize how much influence they actually have as an agent of change within their own communities. These relationships, it just expands. We expand out, right? So we develop relationships through coalitions throughout the community. We develop them and try to build up a different type of relationship through all of our coworker relationships, through all of our expanded peer group relationships, family relationships. We start to change our social dynamic a bit, right? And then at a community level, we engage the coalitions, engage the local government, really start to try and affect the way people are doing things by updating their attitudes towards these types of violence, right? Ultimately, when we get enough communities that are doing this kind of work, it's that same tipping point. Communities if we get enough communities, there's a tipping point where society itself will start to shift its attitudes and then ultimately its behaviors, hopefully leading to less violence. So how do we do it at Advocates? Well, we do SAM and Domestic Violence Awareness Month as well. Happy Sexual Assault Awareness Month, everybody. And one of the things that we did was we took the SAM logo, essentially, and personalized it for our agency and our community. So SAM's team, right? Rather than, one of the big things that we're facing in trying to engage the community is the burden of how heavy these topics are. So we're trying to shift things slightly in our messaging to make it less repulsive to people who just can't engage because it's too much of a burden for them to even think about this stuff. But most people want to be part of a solution. They regard themselves as good people. They care. They really do, even if they're unwilling to engage because of the typical burden. So being on Sam's team, why is it important? What can you do to join the effort? How do we shift our tone about how we talk about these things through an online campaign? And we were pretty successful. We've engaged with county commissioners. We've gotten city council members. We've gotten local leaders in the restaurant community. We've gotten very visible members of the community to join Sam's team and exponentially get our message out there about why addressing sexual violence is important. The cute little pupper there on the left is our poster dog mascot for Advocates. Her name's Juniper. And we decided to use her cuteness and the cuteness of all the pets in the area for a pet walk / march through downtown to do a public proclamation ceremony for Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Again, domestic violence is a very heavy topic. People have a hard time saying like, oh, I want to go to this domestic violence event. Well, when we reframe it a little bit and just try to make it something that is easier to engage with, or there is a benefit of seeing a whole lot of cute animals on parade, all wearing purple, the degree of engagement goes up. We had a lot of interest in this, and then literally the day prior to the event, we had heightened COVID restrictions, which scuttled the whole thing. We're probably going to reboot it this year, though, because the idea of adding a positive element to a heavy topic can improve engagement. It makes it less of a burden to try to engage with these issues. And then ultimately, when we get more people, it will become more visible. And visibility is obviously a huge factor in making sure that communities are willing to engage with these issues. One of our projects is Ask an Advocate. Right as COVID was emerging, we realized that we still need to get our message out to the community, and we need to make sure that we're accessible to them. So rather than just produce video of what we would do with Ask an Advocate is we would find experts in the community on various topics related to the work that we do. And we would have a Q&A that could be attended by any person in real time, and they could chime in with questions of either the advocate or the interviewee. So we had the assistant district attorney join us. We've had a Title IX coordinator at the local college join us. We've had a member of CICASA come and join us, and had amazing conversations, and made ourselves more accessible to people online. Again, adapting to COVID, because obviously social circumstances are challenging, and we need to keep pivoting and keep maneuvering in order to make sure that our message is getting out there. We made sure to do this in Spanish as well. We have a substantial Latinx population here that is engaged through social projects fairly frequently, but we're making a concerted effort to reach non-native English speakers. So we are very fortunate to have 2 Spanish-speaking advocates on our team, and they were able to facilitate this conversation as an interview with a local organization representative who does work, translation and interpretation work locally in the community, helping all members of the community that may have immigrated here or don't speak the language strongly. We're just trying to provide all of our knowledge base to a traditionally underserved community in this way. This project it looks really busy down here, but don't get daunted by it. It's very simple, actually. Drivers of Change is a volunteer opportunity that we have put out to the community and recently confirmed our proof of concept. The whole idea is to find volunteers who want to do something meaningful and really simple. Many volunteers want that. So there are different degrees of engagement, but the easiest one is being a liaison between a group or business and advocates. So we can streamline access to our services because they have a point person inside of that business or organization who knows people at Advocates, knows the numbers to call, knows the services that we provide. So it's specific, just a connection to other entities in our community. The other thing that they could do, and that we ask them to do, is to set up programs for their group or business, right? So we have a liaison who actually has direct access to the leaders in charge of that business or organization, and advocates who can help set up these programs, and they help facilitate the scheduling and the location and the people that should be there and help promote it. We just proved this concept because a local town, Oak Creek nearby, a community member who decided to become a driver of change went straight to them and said, hey, we've got programs for everybody. You all should probably do this. How do we set that up? Excuse me. And they did it. They got buy-in from the local town council. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to go and present for them. So these volunteers, if we can really get this program moving, are going to be invaluable for getting access to businesses, groups, and organizations that we have been trying to reach in a variety of ways for a long time. But with a person inside, we feel like the Drivers of Change program can have real meaningful impact. The graphic down at the bottom is if the driver wants to go to the next level and become a trained presenter, right? Mixed feelings about having volunteers do presentations on their own, but if they are able to get trained in one of our programs and learn how to facilitate it, they can take it back to their social group and present it. If they want to do something more official, we would partner with them, and whatever group they want to reach, we would have an advocate there while they lead a program of ours. So we could offer them whatever backup they needed. So this program has been in development for a while. It's on the ground now. We're already seeing success. We're about a couple months into it. We're seeing some success with it, and we're excited about where it's going. Again, we had to adapt to COVID. So we knew that survivors were facing prolonged exposure to their abusers in domestic violence situations. Obviously, most survivors would have some degree of social interaction where they could reach out to different people, right? But that got constricted by COVID stay-at-home orders really drastically. So many survivors may only have access to essential services. So we targeted essential services and put up these postcards as visual markers. And we gave a protocol to the businesses, or whoever is doing customer service would know if someone says this code word on this postcard out front here, then they need to be taken away from the public and given access to a phone with these phone numbers: law enforcement, the hospital, and advocates, right? So ultimately, it's like if in that moment they are away from their abuser, they happen to be running an errand at a pharmacy or a gas station or some other essential service, they at least had access to advocates or people that could support them if that was the moment they were ready to just be done and don't want to go home again, right? So we wanted to streamline access to that. And the added benefit was that we ended up partnering with upwards of, I think it was like 28 businesses all across the county. So we went to other towns and went to gas stations in nowhere, and many of them were on board. Many of them were willing to participate because it was a very simple protocol. It was get them away from the public, hand them these numbers. That's pretty much it. So it's easy on them, and they feel like they're doing something to support their community's public safety. So yeah, the Mask 19 project is what we affectionately call it. Recently, since the beginning of the year, we started putting together, actually, no, it started well before that. After the uprisings last year and the social unrest of last year, many people were kind of at a loss of how to wrap their heads around social conditions. And we brought a group of people that really wanted to get activated and do something for our community together to at least debrief with each other and unpack a lot of these ideas that are now changing our social dynamic as a society. And we gravitated, we expanded beyond just discussing issues of race to discuss all social issues. Many people came to the table with specific things in our community that they wanted to address, and they wanted other people that are activated in the community that might support them. So we started looking at LGBTQ issues and homelessness and food scarcity and all sorts of things. Thank you, Five. And we got a really dynamic group of people together to look at this concept of social change through this wide-angle lens, right? So we got law enforcement, we've got mentoring, we've got substance abuse prevention, we've got youth advocacy, we've got the integrated community, which serves the Latinx population locally. Many, many different perspectives, many, many different motivations. But we've been gathering monthly since the beginning of the year under the umbrella of social justice. So we've had some remarkable progress, some just exceptional conversations. People are bringing some unique perspectives to the table, which is informing our work internally at Advocates. So it's valuable to us just to be having these meetings. And ultimately, we're developing projects that we as a collective can take to the community to improve public safety. So I'm wrapping up here, just going to walk you through really briefly our catalog of programs that we have. Our programs center on both awareness and skill building, which translates to these skills of being candid, being really bluntly candid about the circumstances that we face, despite shame, despite stigma, despite weirdness and confusion. We're ready to get blunt, right? So this awareness, we're expanding this awareness to being just really not really pulling any punches at all, and being really straightforward in our messaging so that people understand both the scope and the gravity of what we're actually trying to face. And then courage is the backbone of social change. It's the backbone of bystander intervention. You know, what does it take for someone to take a stand, set a boundary, and communicate why someone else needs to modify what they're doing because it's causing harm, right? So these skills require cultivation, and that's what we try to do through our programs. This is our flagship program for middle and high schools and colleges. We offer this to the community, but for the most part right now, we're reaching many youth, and we cover bystander intervention, how to support a survivor, healthy relationship principles, some red flags to look for, things that young people just haven't been exposed to yet. So we work with health programs primarily, but we're also going to be starting to work with clubs at these schools as well. This is our bar program that expanded to include restaurants. One of the highest rates of sexual violence in our area is DFSA. So drug facilitated sexual assault is a substantial problem in our area pre-COVID. Obviously, we haven't seen the same degree of an issue around that, but we're empowering bar staff and managers to be able to recognize problem behavior and how to deal with it as an active bystander. This is the main program that we're pushing out right now. We're moving so far away from traditional sexual harassment training because people hate them. It's pretty simple. Nobody wants to talk about that. And the way that it's framed up is largely about, it's supposed to be about accountability, but the tone is a lot about blame. And people have a lot of preconceived notions about what sexual harassment training is going to be, and they walk in with dread if they attend at all. So again, we flip this a little bit, and rather than looking at how to manage a problem situation, we touch on it. But the main focus is how do we evolve workplace culture to where we don't have sexual misconduct in the workplace in the first place. We have a special breakout session for managers and owners with our executive director, and people really gravitate to that. And we're offering it to local governments and all manner of local businesses. So everything from the resort here in Steamboat, we reached over 2,200 people last year with this program, and just trying to get people to recognize that, like, we set a standard as a community within the workplace that we then model for the community. And that, again, is how we affect social change, is by setting these different standards. We go deep with young people about the trappings of media. We expanded bystander intervention beyond simply interrupting sexual misconduct to include bigoted, homophobic, and sexist behaviors. And then we are going to be unveiling and piloting a brand new program about the queer liberation movement and how it has influenced our understanding of consent and healthy relationships tomorrow for the local college. That's it. 1 hour. Wow, that came in right under the wire. I'm sorry I didn't leave too much room for questions, but I'm going to hang out if anybody has anything they would like to discuss for as long as you would like me to stay here. Thanks so much for your time and attention.
Yeah, thank you so much, Graham. A couple questions. So one question is your position funded by sources aside from the usual DVSA sources?
We have a broad cross-section of sources. I am not, I think it's like 20% is federal funding. Everything else is foundation support and donor support. So yeah, slightly different position, but it gives me a lot more latitude as well.
Yeah, that's great. And another question of which I think is very practical. How do you have time to do all of this?
I don't sleep a whole lot, but I also have a really amazing team. So I work really closely with our executive director and our youth victim advocate to cultivate all of these things. And we're all bringing an immense amount of experience and expertise to the table. So we're informing each other a lot. And that's how we start to cultivate these narratives, is by bringing all these pieces together and then really discussing in depth how we want to convey these ideas through our presentations and projects. So it's a team effort for sure. But for a small agency, we're definitely putting it out there in a big way for sure.
That's so wonderful. Thank you so much, Graham, for sharing all this. It doesn't look like we have any other questions, but for you all, I can make sure that Graham's email is in the follow-up that I'll send out with the link to the recording. I did put the link to the slides in the chat, but I'll also send that out with the link to the recording too. So thank you everyone for joining us, and feel free to fill out the survey that will pop up after this webinar is over, and let us know about how this webinar went. Let us know about other topics you're really interested in. We're always looking for more and more topics, so feel free to reach out and let us know about more topics. And Then also keep an eye out next month, which is May. I don't have the date right in front of me, but our May monthly webinar for Facts and Snacks. I'm actually going to do a presentation about treatment victim advocacy. So if you have questions about how DV offender treatment works and advocacy based in that, definitely sign up for that webinar. An announcement will go out soon. So thank you all. Thank you, Graham. This has been wonderful.
Absolutely. And thank you all for any feedback or questions you have. I really appreciate your time and attention. Take care out there. You're doing good work.